Shabbat Shalom. So, I mentioned when it looked like it might rain on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, that we can actually say Taslit through Hoshana Rabbah. And also we say Psalm 27 through Hoshana Rabbah. And essentially, how, and Charlotte, you get this a lot, and you get this a lot, where like we have a deadline to sign up, right? And then can I still, right? So like there's a deadline, and then there's the real deadline, right? And so Yom Kippur is the end of the period of repentance. That's the deadline, except Hoshana Rabbah is the real deadline. And in fact, also it's appropriate even to wish somebody Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova through Hoshana Rabbah. Okay, and the reason that I mention that is because I need to begin my Drasha this morning with an apology, because I read something recently that leads me to believe that I may have been spreading misinformation for years. And here is that piece of misinformation, right? So we have in both the Parashat and the Ha'azinu, God is referred to as Sur, right? Rock, but like firm rock. Okay, and in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, at the end of it, they sign it and pledge with trust in Sur Yisrael, the rock of Israel, right? Which means Sur Yisrael, whereas in the liturgy, everybody knows, right? Sur Yisrael, right? Rock. And the urban legend is that when they were drafting the Declaration of Independence, which in Hebrew, by the way, is known as the Kehilat Shalom, the Megillah, the scroll of independence. And it's not like there's not a word for declaration. It could be called Parashat Ha'azinu, which would mean literally declaration, but it's called Kehilat Shalom. At any rate, the widespread belief, right, and certainly I believed it, and you probably have heard me say it, and maybe you believed it too, if only because you heard it from me, that why this phrase Sur Yisrael is that there was a disagreement between the majority of the people in power at the time who were utter secularists, right? Ben Gurion and Golda and all these people were complete secularists, and but after the war and as the creation or declaration of the state became more imminent, the Orthodox joined in. I mean, there were always Orthodox Zionists, but even the Haredim joined in for a while. And so the argument was, should the declaration refer to God? And Ben Gurion folks said, absolutely not, because after we refer to God, God doesn't exist, right? And the Orthodox said, we will not sign it unless it refers to God. So the compromise was to refer to Sur Yisrael, the rock of Israel, which, and I think there's like, certainly in liturgy, there is room for creative ambiguity, right? I mean, you can read it and it means whatever it means to you, right? That's, in passing, that's why I am firmly in the camp of those who say, let us, as much as possible, keep the traditional liturgy. Right, because it can mean whatever, but the minute you start rewriting things, right, it has less possibility of interpretation, right? So, Rock of Israel, if you're Orthodox, and certainly in Israel at the time, it was pretty much Orthodox or secular. There was no much presence of a Masorti or Reform movements, right? So, if you were Orthodox, Rock of Israel means God. Right, and if you are secular, it means Haganah or whatever, right? And so that's what most people believe. Daniel Gordis, columnist who you may certainly should be familiar with, says that this is one of those things that everybody knows that just ain't so. Okay, that in fact, there was this same, do we refer to God or not, was going on when Thomas Jefferson was drafting the Declaration of Independence, because there were, and very few of the people who drafted the Declaration were like out and out religious, right, in the traditional sense, right? I mean, there's talk about something that everybody believes that justice is so. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people. Oh, this was founded as a Christian republic. No, sorry. Going to use a word that I shouldn't use in school. It was absolutely not founded as a Christian republic. Very few of the founders were Christians, but many of them were deists, right? Whether the deity, they believed in God, sort of, but set the thing in motion and then stayed out, right? So there's an argument, does the Declaration of Independence, should it refer to God or not? And Jefferson's original draft was, and for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Right? But some people said, too secular. So Jefferson rewrote it with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, right? So the closing line of the Declaration of Independence now, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Okay, so there was a compromise between religious and secular.
Wasn't it the Reverend Thomas Reverend Thomas Witherspoon was one of the signers of Declaration of Independence, demanded a reference to the Almighty.
I don't know. I think if you say so, I'm sure it is probably true. But the point is, it was a compromise, but the compromise was made in 1776, not 1948. Now, so what is the relevance of this? Okay, so it's the spring of 1948, and they're getting ready to declare the state of Israel. And if you're going to declare a state, you need a Declaration of Independence, right? So Ben-Gurion is like, who's going to draft this for us? And he hits on a young lawyer named Mordecai Bain, who had worked as a lawyer for the British Mandate, but then left and joined his family firm. And Bain got this assignment in the middle of Pesach, and Shabbat Chol Hamoed Pesach. He's discussed, like, Ben-Gurion gave me this assignment. Where do I even start? Right? And so somebody suggested that he go talk to this neighbor named Harry Solomon Davidowitz. Now, like I said, it's pretty much either Orthodox or secular in 48, but Harry Solomon Davidowitz was actually an American conservative rabbi who had made Aliyah. He was not born in the States like most conservative rabbis of that generation. They'd been born in Eastern Europe, came to the States as a young man, got his bachelor's degree at Columbia, and then his master's and ordination at JTS. But after practicing as a rabbi for a few years, made Aliyah, where it seems he pretty much jettisoned most of his observance, right? But it's easy to jettison observance, it's hard to jettison not, right? So, Davidowitz really, I mean, he was, like I say, even though he wasn't born here, he was steeped in the American tradition. And so Mordechai Bain went to ask Davidowitz for advice, and David shows him the American Declaration of Independence. And Bain was like, oh, and he starts really copying chunks of the American Declaration of Independence and reworking them a little bit to fit more into the context of Israel, and translate them into Hebrew. Okay, and so there is, a lot of what's in the American Declaration is also in the Israeli Declaration, certainly in terms of like ideals, right? But then they get to the end and things like, how do you translate firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, right? Because if you would ask me, how would you translate divine providence into Hebrew? I would be just as stumped as big, right? Because now I could say hashgacha prati, right? But that is like individual, right? Like God was looking out for me, and that was an instance of hashgacha prati. But I'm not aware of any like concept of that that's more like collective rather than individual. So Bain and Davidowitz are both kind of stumped until Davidowitz says, I know, right? Mitov emunah b'tzur Yisrael, right? Out of reliance on the rock of Israel, right? And I mean, look, you hear me sometimes rail against translations that aren't really translations. They're more like paraphrases, but apparently this is like the same thing, that Sur Yisrael, rock of Israel, is kind of a translation slash paraphrase of divine providence, right? And it certainly has that sense where if you want to say this refers to God, you can. If you want to say it's not God exactly, whatever, right? So it could mean that too, and that's how Sur Yisrael, according to Bordis, right? Who, for all I know, I mean, Danny Bordis, Rabbi Danny Bordis, his grandfather was Rabbi Robert Bordis, who was the great conservative rabbi, and for all I know, Danny's grandfather actually produced the video, because he writes his column, but he doesn't say where he got this information. So I suspect he may really have actually heard this from his grandfather, who probably knew Davidowitz. But that anyway, so Gordis says that this Sur Yisrael is kind of a paraphrase of divine providence. due to the influence of this American conservative rabbi, and that therefore Sur Yisrael is a result of Orthodox secular compromise, but not Orthodox secular compromise in 48, but Orthodox secular compromise in 1776. Good story. Like I say, Bordis doesn't say in his time. I sort of know him, I can send him an email, I want to get back to me, but he doesn't say, he doesn't say like where he gets it from, but I suspect now that more than anybody, he probably heard it from his own grandfather, who probably knew the Davidics, but that's, the influence of the American Declaration on the Israeli Declaration, and, in accordance with the prayer for the country that we say on Shabbat, put it this way, both countries have high ideals in their declarations that they have not always lived up to. So let's hope and pray that they do so, and that God bless both of these countries. Yes, Julie.
The Israeli Declaration of Independence as an adaptation of the American Declaration of Independence. American Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence of Great Britain. In some ways, so is Israel.
Yeah, that's good. That's an excellent point. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, because, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And so, like my dad was involved, like after 45, after the end of World War II, found a surplus of weaponry floating around, right? And, the Haganah tried to get, right, but there was an American embargo on weaponry to the whole Middle East, not just Israel, right? But Jordanians are getting their weapons from Great Britain, et cetera, right? So there was a lot of like surreptitious stuff. If you go like to Baltimore, I mean, actually, this is not gun running, it's the Exodus, right? But the Exodus actually took off from Baltimore, where the Baltimore World Trade Center is. That's where it took off. There's a plaque there. I don't know how many of you besides me have seen it. But anyway, so my dad was involved in the gun running. He had graduated high school, taken off a couple years from college, and how did they manage to do it when it was illegal? And they, like, obviously there's shipping stuff, it doesn't say goods, right? It says agricultural influence, right? Or they would disassemble an airplane and put it in a big crate, and it would say track, right? My dad told me one time, they're loading this crate with a tractor, and the top falls out of the crate in an airplane. Right, but why could they do this? Because it's New York City, and in New York City in 1948, 1945, 46, 47, 40, the longshoremen are all Irish. And the cops are all Irish, right? And the Irish hate the British. So as far as they're concerned, the Jews, the Palestinian Jews, are fighting the British, right? So if they're going to use these weapons to kill the British, tractor, what tractor? We don't see it, right? And that's part of the reason why that gun running was so absolutely right. I mean, the sense of independence and fighting the British absolutely correct. I mean, yeah.
Too. My grandfather also, there's another organization decided or not.
Well, there was a Palmont and there's Goons as well.
Anyway, I was just saying, I grew up listening to these stories that, and it happened in some of that in the United States. But my question is, maybe it's just me, but doesn't Fordham, the term belong is not actually speaking of God. To me, speaks of something much higher power than I am.
Right.
And so, even if it's subtle, it seems to me that almost every document we have, and every official document there is, in some way or another, references divinity, God, some spirit figure. And the purpose is for a bigger protection of the society that's speaking of.
Right, I mean, look, if we're talking about the American Declaration, right, I mean, how does it begin? That same kind of ambiguity, right? They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Right now, okay, creator. If you're religious, who's the creator? God. Right, but you could say the creator is, you know, I don't know, the spirit of the youth, whatever, right? So you're absolutely right. I mean, that is the term for that, the term of art is equivocal language, right? It is most likely, certainly if Gordis is right at the end, but even at the beginning, most likely intentionally equivocal language that it can mean a lot of different things, which is great in you know, in a law or a contract, equivocal language is not so good, right? But in something like this, which is more like aspirational than enforceable, equivocal language works. Okay, thank you. Shabbat shalom. Yeah.